Voltron fans, and this is the 25th anniversary of Voltron the Third Dimension. So we are at the panel called The Making, the Myth, and the Merchandise. It's like it's coming at you. Okay, so I'm Mark Morrell, the host of Let's Voltron, the official Voltron podcast.
I'm Greg Tyler, the co-host.
And I'm Shannon here, and I have often been a host with, or not a host, rather a guest. I'm just glad to have been on with them this many times that I have. The point was that I wanted to make was that the first time I was ever on this was what we did together. This is the whole reason that they contacted me and first had me on the show. So I apologize for being, that nervous thinking about it. You were asking people how many times and how many, that sort of thing. And to think we first talked about this in 2015. So.
Yeah, right. Voltron the Third Dimension. That's great.
You see, I had the 3D glasses here, but that's not exactly how Voltron the Third Dimension was made. They didn't really take it from a two-dimensional show and just add 3D glasses. Sorry. It's a little bit more work than that. Some of the things that happened when Voltron the Third Dimension was just about to happen was they had gone through a period where the internet had just, been born basically in, I guess, the early 90s. And then throughout the 90s, one of the producers from the original show, John Teichman, had noticed that there were some bulletin boards out there on the internet where people had created Voltron fan pages. So that led to him talking to Ted Koppler about maybe bringing back Voltron again. And the first thing that they did was they called it The New Adventures of Voltron, which was just basically rehashed from the original series. And then that brought them to speaking to Mike Young Productions, and Mike Young's company had done a couple of projects with them prior to this, and they said, well, maybe we could do one of those fancy 3D shows that they had just started doing. So Mike Young Productions had also worked with Web on Vitor, the Starfire champion.
More specifically, taking the series that was done with Calico many years prior and converting it into a single feature film. That was specifically what Mike did. They had some voices, music, effects, and everything when they put that together.
So you see on here some of the people that were involved with it. We're going to go over them in a little bit more detail, but these are some of the actual prints from the titles. And then also with Mike Young Productions, there was...
Yeah, this is when we move over to Voltron the Third Dimension. You'll notice that there's a pattern here. The same person with the music. Writer-wise, we know Mark Handler from the original series, but Pamela Hickey and Dennis McCoy, who were hired to take the original miniseries scripts for Vitor, were the ones that consolidated into the film. They were writers of several of the V3D episodes. And there's Kelly Ward again doing the voice direction.
So the producing companies that were involved, Mike Young Productions, Netter Digital, and World Events Productions. Some of the producers were Mike Young, Bill Schultz, Jason Netter, Ted Koppler. With the story and scripts, we had Mark Handler, Pam Hickey, and Dennis McCoy, Sean Catherine Derrick, Scott Guy, Mark Hoffmeyer, and Kelly Ward. In addition to being the voice director, was also a writer. And what is this piece of trivia?
The thing about Voltron the Third Dimension is it is the first time that there were women who either co-wrote or wrote scripts for a Voltron show. Pam Hickey always wrote with her husband Dennis McCoy. Sean Catherine Derrick wrote on her own.
So with voice direction, we had Kelly Ward, and the voices. Most of you are familiar with Michael Bell as Lance, Neil Ross as Keith and Amalgamus, B.J. Ward as Alora and Hagar, Tim Curry as Lotor, Kevin Michael Richardson played Hunk, Zarkon and the narrator, Billy West played Pidge and Queequeg, and Tress MacNeille was the feeder.
So, quick trivia, Tress MacNeille also played in the original Voltron pilot. It was a vehicle team pilot before the first episode was produced. So she voiced some of the female characters in that. So she actually returned to Voltron. And of course she played Merla and other female characters in the last 20 original shows, original episodes as well. Billy West, you might think that Pidge sounds like Fry from Futurama. It's the other way around because Pidge in V3D predates Futurama. So.
And then when we got involved with design, it was Eric Hillary and Dave Max. Storyboards had Michael Swanigan. Animatics was Richard Finn. Motion capture was Mike Parente. Wireframes was Jeff Montre. And CGI rendering was Sean Jordan and Patrick Perez. Now, on one of our episodes of the podcast, we had Josh Kirkwall, who was one of the supervising animators. He was also a character animator for this, and he worked directly with Sean Jordan, Patrick Perez, Jeff Montre, and sometimes had to work hand in hand with Michael Swanigan to, just make sure the storyboards and the animation were in sync. So the sound effects were done by Rick Hinson, who actually won an award, a 1999 Daytime Emmy for Outstanding Sound Editing for this show. And then the music was done by Stephen Marston. So, back when, at the beginning of this, Shannon had mentioned that the first time we got together as a group on the podcast was May 11th, 2015, when we did the first of a two-parter for Voltron, the Third Dimension. And since then, we haven't done single episode reviews of this show yet. So this is still the biggest thing we've done with Voltron, the Third Dimension. So we had episode 40 and episode 41 from 2015. We've also had Ted Kopler on episode 19 back in 2014. We had BJ Ward, where we interviewed her from RetroCon, and that was back in 2018. We had Michael Bell, who was Lance. That was also a RetroCon. And then we had Neil Ross a couple times. We had Neil Ross on, it was from RetroCon in 2017, and then we had him on the podcast when he was promoting his book for the 5th anniversary podcast that we did in 2018. And then we also had Mike Young from Mike Young Productions back in 2017. And as I said, Josh Bricknell, CGI supervisor, we had him 2017. And then Mark Handler, we had very early on in the podcast. One special note, when we interviewed Mark Handler, that was from Shanghai, China. So it was, I think it was really either late at night or early in the morning for him. Mm-hmm. But that was a two-parter as well, and that was back in 2014. Out from the show, not necessarily, like you said, would be used, but were designed.
Concept art. Yeah.
Right. So this is like, what was this, the archive?
The Lion Archive,
yeah.
Beneath the Castle of Lions. So basically, this is meant to, in general, meant to illustrate that just because the show was made using 3D modeling tools, it all started with pen and paper, just like traditional animation.
Right. So this was like the control room. And then this was the hallway leading to the archive. And then on the right you see Lance, and they were talking about Lance's sideburns in this one.
Yeah, that's fun, seeing the notes about that.
So I have a little video here where we're going to show some of the behind the scenes making of the show, and I've kind of whittled it down into about 7.5 minutes. And we're not talking about the writing part of it, even though that happens in the beginning, until the end, because that segues right into Shannon's segment on the myth. Okay?
World Events decided that they wanted to get into this new medium called CGI 3D, and we had previously produced several shows for them, and so they came to us as producers, and we came up with a pilot, some experimental footage, and they convinced themselves that they should actually make the show.
Voltron, the Third Dimension.
Well, storyboards are to translate the scripts into pictures, like a blueprint for the animation company, in this case the CGI company, to make actual pictures move. For instance, we have a scene here where the lions are flying down to the planets. The camera rotates as they come forward and land, and that'll all be done over at the CGI company. Before we go to the animatic process, the artwork is given to David, who composites it and scans it for the abacus. After it goes from the abacus, which is the room next door to us, it comes over to Rich's department.
Basically at this point, I sit here and I put the animatic into order, numerical order for the episode, putting down the timing of the show, and also put the voice track underneath.
My new road beasts will enjoy tearing those lions to shreds!
But this suit is part of the motion capture process. Nikki's wearing an outfit that's covered with 35 markers, which are actually these reflective balls. The room has 8 infrared cameras mounted around the ceiling, and what that'll do will capture her motion on the balls that are placed on strategic points in her body, so we can capture her motion in 3D. Well, Nikki, what we've done is put markers on your sword here as well, and I'm going to have you start on the X and pretend that you're our heroine Alora, and I want you to give me a good swing to the right and maybe a swing to the left, okay? Without hitting me in the head. So this is how the infrared cameras see the motion. The motion analysis system then stores the information, it's rendered and then sent over to the animators. The animators then inject the motion into the characters, and that's what gives them such lifelike qualities. So now let's take a look at Nikki's motion in 3D.
Sure.
So what do you think?
This is all just amazing. I tell you, no wonder they look so lifelike on screen.
Here they come.
So can you tell me, why does Voltron look so different from other 3D shows?
There's a couple reasons. One of the reasons would be when we render Voltron, we can have shadows, reflections, refraction, things that generally you don't see in kids shows because they're too costly and too CPU intensive. Essentially, it takes too long to render things like that. Using Lightwave, which is the software that we use, and Magpie, which allows us to do the mouth positions, and it gives us just the right render for us to be able to pull off things looking more realistic.
Once the model is constructed, and we've actually it has form, and it has been textured, which gives it the look that we want, then we come in and we animate it in what we call a wire frame, where each individual piece can be moved and manipulated like a hand is separate from the arm, so we can bend the hands, the mouths, and all these things move, and we create what we call a wireframe preview, and then we go through what we call the rendering process, where we send the shot to our bank of computers, and those actually physically draw all the pictures that are the final pictures that you'll actually see on TV.
Music has a huge effect on the picture because by itself it just looks very flat. You know, the picture looks great, but it's just flat. You add the music, it adds drama, it adds action, helps to tie everything together.
What's stopping me from taking my shot at Lotor? Lotor will blow him out of the sky. No drone pilot knows that maniac like I do.
We started by looking at the old series and asked ourselves what kept Voltron so popular all of these years when other shows like it, other space shows, other robot shows have come and gone. And the answer is, we think, the mythical elements of the series. Voltron he's a legend. He's made out of 5 lions that are mystical and magical. He wasn't just built in some R&D lab by a bunch of engineers. So we have 5 lions. They're connected to the Castle of Lions, which in turn is connected to 5 primal elements. And our Princess Allura lives in that castle. She grew up there, and she goes down into the archive chambers and searches for her destiny, trying to uncover the mysteries of the lion. That her father appears, King Alfor, as a ghost who speaks to her from beyond. So these kinds of elements are what we think makes the series interesting and makes it unique.
So, Pam Hickey and Dennis McCoy, what sort of secrets are uncovered in your episodes?
Well, an example is Lost Souls, which is episode 4, where we find out that there is a symbiotic link between the pilots and the lions themselves. The pilots are simply the souls of the lions. They don't run without them.
You know, visually this is interesting. The kids will get it. They tried to get together to form the monster. It doesn't work. A battle is lost. And through the plot, you find that the lions actually reject the droids. It's very interesting the way it looks.
You heard and saw Mark Hanlon there during the clip that was played. And Mark was my first of many professional mentors, and Voltron had a lot to do with that. One of the things that was said earlier today that I really feel strongly, I want to reemphasize this real quick, because I thought about putting it in this presentation and I took it out, is the idea that even in the course of the iterations that we've had for television, there have been so many different versions of Voltron, but going back to the original show, it was established that there were different dimensions and different universes. This show, I didn't touch on it in the slides, but this show does the same thing. And I have taken the position personally that all Voltrons are valid if there are multiple universes, and that's been established from the beginning. All things are possible. The premise in this particular iteration is that 5 years after the imprisonment of Lotor, this is why I brought up what I just did, because if anyone follows the iterations, Voltron Force is also exactly 5 years after. So already you've got a diverging timeline. But in this one, 5 years after Lotor was imprisoned after his defeat, he's now half cyborg. And he's escaped from where he was imprisoned, a place called Bastille 12, and he and Hagar are now threatening the galaxy again. So now it's up to Voltron to come back together and stop Lotor. Now their biggest other antagonist, and I brought this up earlier today, is Antagonists, who essentially, instead of having all the ambassadors from all the planets in the Galaxy Alliance come in and out of the show, he was the collective database for how they felt about everything. Would be calculate all their votes, and whatever he said basically went. And he was very big on technology was everything. Humanity wasn't always necessary. Mike Young also elaborated on that as well. Despite being marketed as a direct sequel to Voltron Defender of the Universe, there were some characters who did have changes to their storylines. Keith, Allura, Hagar, her name included a different spelling, which only happened in this iteration. Most of them, she had 2 G's. Here is Hagar. And Zarkon as well. But other characters carried through with plot elements from the original continuity. Lance, and to a degree, Lotor. We're going to walk through those real quick. Allura's backstory in V3D, there's mentions that she actually trained on simulators as a little girl, and we're shown flashbacks of this. Well, in DOTU, none of that was true. She was learning everything from the very beginning. Allura and Keith was always an interesting one, because in one of the episodes that World Events had commissioned later on for the show, there is a scene where they're at Alfor's tomb, and Alfor talks to them. You and my daughter fought very well together. Keith, you are a true champion. And Allura turns to Keith and, well, Keith, I guess he approves of you. So it's like, pretty much just like Daddy's blessing and seal of approval, and then you skip to V3D and you're like, what happened? What broke them up? Because there's no sense that they were together and broke up, or it was just kind of nebulously kept there. Now, here's where we see things kind of carry through. For Lance, in episode 2, in Red Lion Breaks Loose, Coran explains that Lance's refusal to accept the meat, they're told, you can't take the lions, you can't fly, this is an alchemist telling them they can't do this. Coran says it stems directly from his village being attacked when he was young, and he wants to take action, he wants to do something, which actually tracks from the backstory of the two-parter from the '84 series. I actually alluded to it a minute ago, where Coran's son with the clone that is claimed to be Coran's son shows up, and they go up to the mountains, and supposedly the wife and son were sent to another dimension a long time ago. There's a conversation between Lance and Pidge, where Lance tells Pidge about growing up like that. And I learned in my early communications with Mark Handler, in fact his very first letter to me, that two-parter was one of the very first scripts that he ever wrote for the show. And so he continued this through as head writer, clearly. For Lotor, his appearance change was explained away as a result of his defeat, which implies it's from the injuries sustained at the end of the 1984 show. And he's described as being 86% cybernetic in the very first episode. Now, Zarkon, it's implied that he's, in the '84 show, that he's completely defeated and Lotor's in charge, and they drive Lotor out at the end of the first show. But here, Zarkon's still around, and in fact, he's acting like, I'm completely informed, and I'm an ambassador for change. Has Zarkon really changed? Now, Hagar's backstory, in some ways it tracks with the original show, and in some ways it doesn't. Because in Fleet of Doom, you see her talk about that she was good at one point, and then she met Zarkon, and he turned me into this. V3D also taps into the idea that she was young and beautiful once, but it also taps into the idea that she and Alfor were once an item, which might have meant that Alfor and Hagar would have ended up together, and that would have been a whole different show. Okay. Lions and Six. While the lion's connection to the elements is emphasized, just like in other series, the elements, the series also emphasizes more of the synergy between lions and pilots. Example here, talking about episode 2 again. The spirit of Alfor explains to Allura that the lion is the power, but the pilot is the soul. Again, the theme of soul and humanity is running throughout this entire show for the full 26 episodes. And pardon me if I'm squinting, these lights are really bright. Later in episode 25, I think it is, 25, the trial of Voltron, Coran reminds us the lions are linked by this mystical life force, a connection beyond any science of understanding. And the force extends to the lions' pilots. Their inner strength, their spirits, fuel Voltron when all else fails. And there's another argument, Amalgamus has many of these, but this particular one in episode 8, from the episode's name is Descent into Madness. And they're having to push him to allow them to prove there's something more than circuits and data processors involved with the lions. It's like trying to say, can we bring you back data? Because that's the only language Amalgamus understands. And so it takes a lot of effort to do that. Telling her to exactly how to defeat Dracotron, which is, Greg, you explained it pretty well the other hand, but we're kind of making it easy. Can you explain Dracotron technically?
So this show establishes a mythology that the robot lions of Eris had sort of direct counterparts that served evil that were robot dragons. And so this is kind of one of the first times that they encounter those dragons. And it establishes that at some point in the past, Alfor had led some kind of a conflict against the dragons.
Appreciate that, thanks. So when Laura hears this call out, she follows it, and in the process meets Queen Ariella, or rather the ghost of Queen Ariella, the first queen of Eris. So in this mythology, we learn that there have been rulers with certain degrees of power throughout generations. In Ariella's case, it's kind of a Superman. I'm saying Superman because I'm actually referring to that character. The idea is she comes in a shuttle from outer space, and these lion spirits come and kind of help raise her, a la, I don't know, Tarzan of the Apes or something. But the idea that she finds her power, brings the castle together, brings the lions together, all of that. And so when Allura goes there, she learns things from Ariella that she had not previously learned from her father. And that's a lot of what I was just detailing that's on the screen, but more in my own words. So what she's told is that the lions have always been with you. The idea that the connection, this is again talking about the connection. And we, meaning the queen and the lion spirits that raised her, are still with you today. For your destiny is our destiny. Ariella's choice of words seems to imply that she's always with Allura as well, though that's never called upon again in the series. We only see her for like these couple of episodes and then she disappears. And there is a battle that happens where the lion robots are actually destroyed at the midpoint of the series, episode 14, the Troika moves. In episode 16, the Voltron Force strikes back. The members of the Voltron Force, except Allura, are surprised to discover the lions are, in fact, not destroyed. Allura explains the spirits of the lions were the ones that created their robots' bodies and were able to correct them over. So it's interesting how the mechanics in that respect are a lot different than the other shows where this is the one I think that I've seen all the shows that has the greatest synergy where even though we've had souls and we've had bodies, the souls here are able to self-maintain. And this is a little bit more about Dracotron. I just realized I had dropped the reference far too soon. There's a quote on here, I'll just let you read it over while I talk. But it's interesting that they decided to go in this one big legendary robot versus other big legendary giant robot, even though we had all these other elements in the normal formula that we were used to. And in some ways that was interesting because Dracotron required them to do different things and look at taking different measures than they have in the past. Kind of broke the formula in some occasions. There's some records that are referred to here on the slide, and that's part of what Allura was trying to track down and find. And oh, here it is. According to the Lion Archives, remember the sketch that we saw earlier? This is the place that Greg was talking about. That's where the information is for defeating Dracotron. And it talks about under the neck, there's a weak spot. Just a side note, what are the bad people in the bad side, point of view, on Voltron without henchmen? Queequeg and Lafitte were the two new henchmen for Lotor in this particular show. I don't know if you guys, would you say their humor level was on the same level as that maybe of Cossack of the original series, except they could play off each other instead of being a one-person?
Yeah, I kind of think of them back in the 90s. Reboot had Hack and Slash that served Megabyte, and Sonic the Hedgehog had Scratch and Grounder. Just the pair of incompetent nitwit thugs. I mean, that's basically who they were.
Okay, and then the last bit that I want to get to. This was one of those things that you just don't ever imagine happening. during the run of Voltron the Third Dimension, I was actually contacted by the late Bill England, who did all the graphic design at World Events Productions. And they knew that I had worked on a star map that I had put out on the web before I had moved to LA many years before, like in the mid-90s. Because I was headed out for my professional career, and I'll say for here, I honestly thought I was going to be leaving fandom behind me because those two couldn't coexist. I'm happy to be wrong about that. Let's make that very clear. But anyway, Bill called me up and said, we want to do this star map for our website. And I'm like, okay. And we had to work on some things, and there were some things they wanted added, and some things changed in it. But, so this is the collaboration between Bill England and myself. It did appear on a section called Planet Plaza when they had a site for the Third Dimension series. What you see rolled out there is a print that there was talk that they might use for VIP events to sell the show in the future. I don't know if it was ever distributed. This print was sent to me. It may be the only one in existence, so I honestly don't know. But I do want to show that. Thank you. Like I was saying, these go all the way back to notes. This is 1985. They're not the best drawings. Okay, I was a lot younger back then. But these are some of my original notes of what I just sat there watching. I had recorded the episodes on VHS and wrote stuff down over and over and over. They didn't even start naming quadrants until that last batch of episodes that they produced. And even then, not all of them were put in places. I kind of had to extrapolate where I thought some of them were. Now, what's interesting when I put this particular one up is here, I have Eris in one quadrant, and on the map you saw on the prior slide, it's in a different one. And that's the one that actually got used in the Third Dimension. I said it was in that quadrant. This actually still works. The problem was there was a comet called the Philos comet that rode the border between the Coral system and the Azure system, and so you could argue that's the dashed line kind of going around here. So I forget where the heck does Philos' comet go. And so World Events flipped to them. But it still works. But for some people who want to understand how far back that actually goes, that's how the map really is. And by the way, if you want to know the full story of how it got from this to what you just saw, on the 25th anniversary of the site going up, when I put it up before I went to LA, Greg did this huge interview with me about 2 years ago now.
Something like that.
At Lion Pilots and Bots.
Yeah, so I have a website called lionsandpilotsandbots.com, and it's got a bunch of Voltron content, including that conversation with Shannon about the star map.
This was the piece that actually made me cry, and I'll try not to cry telling the story. In one of the episodes called The Trial of Voltron, it involves the Voltron Force being put on trial for things that have happened. And that's the judge there. Judge Armistice runs down the names of all the planets in the quadrant and how they've voted. And most of them were either dictated by the show or what the show had already said, or clearly by other choices that they had made in episodes of Third Dimension. But they got down the list and they got to Planet Lyra from the original show. And there is no reason in the world that would have been there, except for the fact that I chose to put Lyra in that same system as Planet Eris. And I'm sitting at home and they're running the list off and I'm like, there's only one place they could have gotten that from. I may have never written an episode of the show, which was my childhood dream, to get there. But I'm sitting at home hearing that. What? Sorry. Every time I told them.
It's all right. Yes.
So, thank you. But there were other, like we've talked, there are other forms in this series. They took Voltron into more areas. There was a stealth version. There was a version of Voltrex, which if you were in the prior panel with Pete White, he showed some of the toys for that. They never got it into the show because they never got their third season, but Voltrex would have been in their third season. I know that because I did an interview for Mike Young for part of that documentary that was done, but I ended up on the cutting room floor, but it had been a great opportunity to meet Mike all those years ago, who I got to meet with again recently because my husband actually worked on one of his more recent productions called Soccer Football Movie, which is available on Netflix, and it was nice getting to reunite with him. But that's all I have from what I know on the myth, and so our merchandise expert is sitting next to me. Greg Stern.
All right, let's talk merchandise, everyone. Okay, so Trendmasters, which at the time was based in St. Louis, along with World Events Productions, became the major licensee for Voltron: The Third Dimension. They started out not by making a V3D toy, but by re-releasing the famous die-cast Matchbox toy from the 80s. With some changes, as Pete had pointed out. There were fins on the shoulders and some color differences, and I would argue the quality of the materials was not quite as high, but the packaging looked really great. And one thing that's very interesting about this packaging is that although it says Voltron Defender of the Universe and the later stuff for the Third Dimension, the artwork of that robot is actually not from Voltron: The Third Dimension, but from some concept animation that Mike Young had done that they used as the intro to the New Adventures of Voltron, which was a reissue of the later episodes of the 80s show. So it had a 3D CGI opening, and that artwork is actually from that title sequence rather than V3D itself. So moving into the V3D merchandise with the New Adventures Voltron on the box art, there's a set there called Mighty Lion Force, which was 5 plastic lions with teeny tiny little pilots that could form an 11-inch Voltron. You could buy it in a box set or the 5 individual lions there. The red and green were packaged together. And then a Lion Force. All these toys are very confusingly named, by the way. It's like Mighty Voltron, Lion Voltron, Mighty Lion Voltron, Mighty Lion Vehicles. It's really, really confusing. But moving on to additional confusion, Lion Force Voltron is an 8-inch all-plastic combiner that Pete had mentioned in the prior panel as well. There's a small 5 or 6-inch Galaxy Guard Voltron. It was a non-transforming static figure with a missile launcher. And Pete had also mentioned the Cyber Sentinel and the remote control Voltrons that were battery powered. They look virtually identical, but they have minor differences in functionality. They also made action figures, more action figures than any other company has produced for Voltron. So, at least of characters. And so there you see the 5 Voltron pilots dressed in rather more colorful outfits than they actually wore in the show. And Hunk looks like a walking brick. It's quite amazing. Then they had across the bottom there Zarkon, Lotor, and Hagar. Hagar looks in particular nothing like she did in the show. She actually had, if you remember from Masters of the Universe in the 1980s, they had a character getting man-E faces with a knob on his head that would change between human, monster, and robot. Hagar had a lever on the back that when you moved it, turned her face from a young woman into this weird-looking lizard creature thing. And she's wearing rather risque clothing there that she never wore in the show. But there you go. And then they made stealth versions of these characters. We had touched on the fact that in the later episodes they had the stealth lions, and these were the stealth versions of the pilots. And their outfits actually look closer to what they were in the television show.
Hunk looks considerably better.
He does. You'll also see that they use a lot of chrome on these figures, and Trendmasters is notorious not only for having horribly applied chrome that flakes off in the package So it's very difficult to find any of these figures with most of their chrome still. The materials for many of their products, unfortunately, have not survived the test of time all that well. And we'll touch on that in a moment. But there were also stealth cycles, which were not featured in the show, but each was bundled with an action figure, and I think they were just repackaging the figures seen on the previous slide. The stealth lions did appear in toy form, so there was a combinable 11 or 12 inch set of the 5 stealth lions. You could buy a non-transforming 5.5 inch figure called Galaxy Guard Stealth Voltron. Other toys included a role-play toy, just as back in the 80s, LJN had made a Blazing Sword toy. Trendmasters made a Blazing Sword for the third dimension. This one was kind of fun because it would actually telescope, so you could collapse the blade into the hilt somewhat, and then by pressing a button, it would make some noises and light up, and then the blade would pop out, kind of like some of the lightsaber toys that Hasbro's made over the years. On the right there, you see Voltrex. This was the toy version, or the only released toy version of the dinos that were slated for the 3rd season that never came. So one thing that's very interesting is that that robot was built from 6 dinos, including a silver pterodactyl kind of dinosaur, which makes me wonder what the plan was in the show for that. You know, would it have been a drone? Would Amalgamists have operated it? I don't know, and we probably never will know. There's I love and hate these toys. I'm obsessed with them because they have tremendous play value, but because of the horrible material quality, most of these are in pretty sad shape today. On the left, this was the Voltron Mighty Lion Vehicles. Yeah, confusing name. A 20-inch toy that Pete had described that would hold the V3D action figures. The Black Lion in particular is ridiculously fragile. If you look at it the wrong way, it will shatter. The Blue Lion's lower jaw is notoriously missing in most loose examples today. They had a stealth version as well that was about the same size and had similar issues with the chrome and the material quality. Okay, this is an image that Jonathan Shyman on Flickr, who is known in the real world as Jonathan Tchaikovsky, he is a very knowledgeable collector of Trendmasters prototype toys. This is one of the very few prototype toys that exists of the Dracotron robot that was seen in V3D. There were also Voltrex themed cycles for the action figures, Voltrex themed character figures that were never released, and Voltrexes of different sizes, many other things that are not covered here that Pete did.
Yes, that we had Jonathan Tchaikovsky as a guest talking about Trendmasters prototypes. Was Greg's first official episode as co-host of the podcast.
Yeah, back in early 2016, just before the announcement of Legendary Defender, so pretty cool. Yeah, so we got to address the elephant in the room. A lot of people don't like the way Voltron the Third Dimension looks, so these slides are, why the hate? Or do these pixels make my butt look big? So what I wanted to do was show an image from Voltron the Third Dimension alongside an image from some of the other shows and movies of that time, just to kind of bring us back to reality, because V3D may look bad by today's standards, but is it much worse, if any worse, than some of the other shows of the time? So there's a frame grab on the right there from Reboot, and this is a 4K upscale that I found on YouTube from a season that was contemporary with Voltron the Third Dimension. The designs don't look any more realistic to me, certainly, but they're very stylized. Another show from that time called Shadow Raiders, and again, it was kind of a style, it was an evolving technology, the art was evolving. I don't know that V3D is any worse than any of these other shows. There's Roughneck Starship Troopers Chronicles. I do think the human faces arguably maybe look a little more realistic, but I would say they're just as stylized as V3D, they're just stylized in different ways. They look more like Masters of the Universe characters than real human beings. So again, are they better or worse? Lastly, I wanted to touch on a movie, Toy Story 2. The animation at that time was, again, evolving, and these are admittedly very stylized characters that were meant to look more cartoonish than real. But again, look at the V3D characters, look at the Toy Story 2 people, and objectively, is V3D any worse? I don't think so. And again, do the lions look good? I think they look pretty darn awesome. I think one of the things that makes this show look, it doesn't have as much shine as it could because the show was very dark. It's very hard to find screen caps of the show where you can clearly see everything in the scene because for some reason, maybe technical and economic reasons, they kept the lighting level low. I have read, but I have seen nothing to verify this, that lower ambient light at that time reduced the rendering time for 3D graphics. So it may have been that they tried to keep the lights down to keep the show, you know, produced at a good clip. But when you see the lions there in high resolution and brighter colors, I really like them. Here are some of the environments in higher resolution than you ever see in the television show. So there's the Castle of Lions. At standard def video resolution, you see a lot of moire effect as the camera pans around, and that's the weird little flickers that you sometimes see in computer graphics or even in HD television. If you see someone like a weather person and they're standing with some really intricate pattern on their clothing, as they move, you'll see a weird jittery pattern, and so you see a lot of that in V3D. But in high def, my goodness, I think the Castle of Lions and Castle Doom look pretty darn cool.
Now, I thank you all for staying a couple minutes over. I know that this has run a little long. Apologies for that. But I want to leave on a note why the show is worth remembering. Despite the mixed feelings about the show, many other of these series we just talked about would probably likely not have been produced because this was the first show that was made completely in the United States. We did not stress that, I think, strongly enough at the beginning. It paved the way to explore the frontier of CGI animation for TV storytelling because of that. And also, of all the various Voltron mythos presented, Voltron the Third Dimension was the only one of them to put a sole woman at the head of the creation of the robot with the introduction of Queen Auriella. Voltron Force and Voltron Legendary Defender do feature women in the origin, but as part of a larger group. Again, thank you for taking the time with us today.